Hello, everyone, and welcome into the Monday edition of the X's and Dogs podcast. Today is the Monday after the divisional round of the NFL playoffs, and I thought we were treated to two really good games and two not so good games this weekend. The game that surprised me the most was the Broncos and Bills game. It was a fantastic football game. I thought both teams played really well, very competitive, obviously coming down to the last kick, similarly to the Rams and the Bears game that happened last night. But particularly in that Broncos and Bills game, I thought the Bills were going to go in there and beat Denver. I did think Denver would make it a close game like they did, but I thought the Bills would inch them out in the end just based on the experience and the quarterback advantage that the Bills, I thought, had in that game. And I do want to say I thought the officiating was rather just inconsistent in that game. I am someone who was under the belief that whenever there is a 50-50 ball that, a defensive player and a wide receiver are kind of fighting for after the player hits the ground. And I know there's the whole argument where did Brandon Cooks even have possession of the ball, or was the ball kind of being bobbled still? Whenever I watch it, I thought it was pretty clearly a situation where Brandon Cooks hit the ground, and who was the Broncos? Whoever was the Broncos secondary player, just kind of took the ball from him. And I thought there's been numerous occasions, in the regular season and even in the playoffs where that same play has happened and it's been called a catch for the receiver. And in this game, obviously, we all know it was deemed an interception, and the Broncos got the ball. Obviously, that was the possession that I think that was the play that if the Bills were able to get the reception there, they're probably winning the game. They're deep in the Broncos territory there and just need to kick the field goal to win. Obviously, the interception occurs, and now the Broncos were able to move the ball down the field to their credit and kick the field goal to win the football game. So I thought that call was a little questionable. I'm not going to lie. Got into some arguments with some people on Twitter, as always, about it. I just see that play as something that happens pretty frequently and just wasn't called the way it normally is in that game. And I also thought they needed to do a better job of just reviewing the play. I thought they pretty much spent like 10 seconds reviewing it, and it just didn't make a lot of sense to me. I thought in the moment they should have stopped the game because it was a huge, very important play for both those teams, and I thought that the officiating could have done a better job to make it seem like they were truly reviewing it to the full extent that they could. But anyway, there were some good games. I did believe the Rams were going to beat Chicago in that one. Obviously, the Seattle game to me was pretty surprising. I thought the 49ers would have been more competitive in that one, but Seattle looks like a really good team. I think they have a good shot to go to the Super Bowl. They're going to host a Rams team. That's going to be a fantastic game. We saw the game those two played in Seattle earlier in the season, which was probably the game of the year. And on the other side of things, I think obviously you're going to choose the Patriots in that game because Bo Nix is out with the injury, but I think they're playing Stidham. Stidham, is that how you say it? The backup quarterback in Denver. Stidham. But anyway, they're going to play their backup. And I still think they can be competitive with the Patriots just because of how good the defense is there in Denver. And it's going to be, of course, a home game for the Broncos. Also, the Patriots offense hasn't played particularly well in the few games this postseason. So, I think the Broncos can definitely keep them in the game. I don't know if they're going to be able to win it with the offense that they'll probably be playing with, but should be a close game nonetheless. I'm super excited for these conference championship games because it's just new teams this year in comparison to some of the previous years. I know the Rams have been there a lot, but we haven't seen the Seahawks in a while. We haven't seen the Patriots in a while, and we haven't seen the Broncos in a while. So I think we're all kind of excited to have some fresh teams in there. Hopefully one day we can see our Cleveland Browns play in some divisional or conference championship games. And that's where we're gonna shift our attention to next, because we have a pretty big decision to talk about here. And I think it's a decision that's getting narrowed down in a way where we kind of have a lot more information and we have a good idea of at least a short list of guys that the Browns are looking at to potentially hire for their next head coach. And that list entails of Todd Monken, Jim Schwartz, Grant Udinski, Nate Scheelhaase, and Jesse Minter. I think that's kind of the full list for me currently. I wouldn't put Todd Monken on the list at all, but he did get requested for the second interview, which was very surprising to me. I thought he was pretty much confirmed to be following Harbaugh out to New York. In that case, would kind of remove him from being a head coach here in Cleveland. But, they did request the second interview, so I think they are considering him for an option. To me, obviously the least favorite of the candidates. But I guess what we can do is just go through one by one. It's a list of 5 guys currently, and I think we can just go through, talk about each one, because I think we'll start to get this list narrowed down even more as we kind of progress through this week, go into the weekend, and I think honestly next week we'll probably have maybe even an answer on who they hire, if not a very good direction pointed, for where they're going to go. So first, like I said, Todd Monken. I've spoke on Todd a few times, on my podcast here, and I'm just not really interested in hiring a guy at his age who hasn't been a head coach up to this point. I think he's had some successful stints as offensive coordinator at different locations, but I think that's really just all he can be in this league is an offensive coordinator who's pretty good at times. I just don't see him as a head coach, and I don't think for a guy who's 60 years old, if you're going to go the older coach route here, I think the obvious answer is Jim Schwartz. I just don't think it makes much sense to hire Todd Monken, who to me also doesn't have the personality that this team should probably be looking for, within their next head coach after moving on for Kevin Stefanski, who is not the most rah-rah guy, not the most, leader of men type of guy. So just not interested in Todd Monken. That leads to Jim Schwartz, who's the kind of next step up in the interest totem pole, I guess, for Cleveland Browns head coach, in my opinion. Jim Schwartz, I think it's come out more and more that there is legitimate interest and that he should not be slept on as a candidate for the Browns head coach position. I'm not going to say I was sleeping on him before that, but I definitely didn't take him as seriously as some of these other candidates, and I'm going to tell you why. Because if you were to tell me that this whole coaching search is truly Andrew Berry's project, it is his decision, he's going to go through the process, Jimmy Haslam's not going to have much of a say in it. If that was the case, I find it extremely hard to believe that process would result in Jim Schwartz being the solution. I just think Andrew Berry probably is looking for a guy who can be here long term, who's young, who's innovative, who's data driven. One of these young up and coming head coaches who I'm going to talk about here after Jim Schwartz. And I just don't think Jim Schwartz fits that mold in any capacity. So that said, if Jim Schwartz were to be hired. And I think this makes sense because now it seems there is an actual interest here. But if he does get hired, I think it is a very much impacted by Jimmy Haslam hire. I think Jimmy Haslam will have his fingerprints all over this one. And, I'm not going to say that that's not going to happen. Obviously, we all know that there's a good chance we all know as Browns fans, every big decision that's made, you have to take a step back and look and think to yourself, how much of a say did Jimmy Haslam have on this decision? And if you aren't a Browns fan, you probably don't look at it from that lens. But those of us who know this organization well, that Jimmy Haslam, regardless of what they say behind the scenes, he more than likely is going to have a pretty large fingerprint in the decisions made. And this one, to me, obviously, I think Haslam is a big fan of Jim Schwartz. He's talked about him numerous occasions very highly. I think he believes that defense was fantastic, and it was. We had a really good defense. But, ultimately the decision to hire Jim screams a Haslam decision. And we'll see if they do go that route, of course. But ultimately, I just don't think it's a process that Andrew Berry would kind of lead and ending up hiring Jim Schwartz. That leads us to the next candidates, and these are all guys who I think are legitimate options if Andrew Berry is the one making the decision. And I have Scheelhaase and Udinski kind of in the same tier here, and they are the 1A, 1B tier. These are the two guys to me that should be the candidates that the Browns are considering the most currently. They should be the guys who we all want to be hired as fans of the team. And I guess there's a couple reasons for this. First off, both of these guys, while limited resumes, and Scheelhaase does have a longer, wider resume than Udinski. Both of them are limited. While limited, they are impressive, and they have kind of rare, a rare reputation around the league for guys this age, where they have plenty of coaches who have said just very, very positive things about them, insinuating their work ethic, their knowledge, their ability to coach guys is just unlike others in the league. And for both of these guys, that very much piques my interest. Also, additionally, I think offensively, this is a football team who needs help offensively. And even more than that, I think hiring an offensive coach, in my opinion, is always preferred. And I'll be honest with you guys, it's a little bit of a bias in my opinion. I would rather not have to go through the offensive coordinator cycle that a lot of teams have to go through if they don't have the play caller offensive head coach. You see this quite frequently with teams who have a coach like D'Amico Ryans, or these defensive guys like Sean McDermott, or even John Harbaugh to an extent, although he's not a exclusively defensive guy. But there's these head coaches who do have success in the league, but they every 2 to 3 years they're looking for a new offensive coordinator because either their current offensive coordinator was really good and moved elsewhere to either become a head coach or just have a more impact role in the next team. So either that occurs or the offensive coordinator just isn't that good and they're looking for a new one. Anyway, and I'm just someone who every time the Browns are looking for a head coach prefers an offensive mind because of that reason. I just think, if you can find the offensive head coach who will stay with the team for a long time, like, your Shanahans, your McVays, your O'Connells, these guys who are, every year give their team an offensive advantage. And there never really seems to be that step back because they're not losing the coordinator every 2 to 3 years and having to rebuild that whole entire offensive staff. So that's a long-winded way to say, I do prefer the offensive minds. And I think Andrew Berry, it seems based on the list here, it seems that Andrew Berry does also prefer the offensive minds. And I think he hinted at that in his press conference, saying that this team needs to get way better offensively at the quarterback position, etc. So obviously these are my two top options. I think you can't really go wrong with either one of them. If I did have to pick, I probably would pick Nate Scheelhaase, just because he has the McVay experience. He's been in the NFL for I think like almost a decade now. Udinski has a little bit shorter of a track record. I think Udinski could have the higher ceiling. Like I think he legitimately could be one of those McVay Shanahan types, but you're taking a little bit of a risk on a guy who doesn't have a lot of experience or a track record. So, whichever one of these guys though you do decide to go with, if this is going to be the list, I think you can't really complain. Both of them, I think, have the potential to be the coach of the football team for a long time. Similarly to what we saw Kevin Stefanski do, where he was here for 6 years. Like that's kind of what we're trying to that's kind of the new bar that I think we need to have. And it's part of the reason why I'm not so interested in Schwartz. I think if we do hire Schwartz, we're kind of just settling on the safe option where, it's a coach who probably won't be here for more than 5 years. So you're not really taking a gamble on a guy who can be the coach for the next decade. And you kind of know who Jim Schwartz is at this point because he's been a coach for decades and decades. And that's why I'm more willing to take the risk on one of these guys. I think you just have to be willing to give them a little bit more leeway. Like they might not have it all figured out next season. And that's something we don't do well enough here in Cleveland. With head coaches, like give them a couple years to figure it out, especially whenever you're hiring a guy who's 30 or 35 years old, doesn't have a ton of coaching experience, but obviously they have the ability to be good coaches. You just need to let them learn at this level. And I think that is going to be key for this organization to just stay patient, especially the owner, stay patient. Let the course run itself out, and just let the coach learn. Let him be comfortable here in Cleveland, and whoever you hire, I think that's going to be very important. The last guy is Jesse Minter on the list. To me, Jesse Minter, I think we requested the second interview with him. I find Jesse Minter to be very intriguing. I said it a couple weeks ago, or probably about a week ago at this point. Jesse Minter is probably the most sought-after candidate that we are bringing in for an interview here in Cleveland. That said, I do not believe we will end up getting Jesse Minter because of the fact that he is very sought-after. He's probably going to have other options, other offers. He already has a ton of other interviews. He's gotten interest from the Ravens. I think he's gotten interest from the Steelers. I believe even maybe like Tennessee has expressed interest in him. There's a lot of good, better situations that he could be joining than Cleveland. And for that reason, I find him to be rather unlikely as a candidate. Although if he does decide that he wants to coach the Cleveland Browns, I think you can probably throw him on level playing field with Scheelhaase, Udinski, because, and maybe even a touch higher than those guys because of the reputation that he has. And I think he is a guy who is clearly at the point where he's ready to be a head coach. And, I think he'll have that advantage over Scheelhaase and Udinski, just based on the experience that he does have. So that does wrap up the list. I think to me, it's really between Scheelhaase and Udinski. I think that's the point that we're at in the process. Obviously, I think Jim Schwartz does have an equal likelihood to those guys to get the job. In my opinion, I would not go down that route, but the Browns are more than likely going to consider him, it appears. And as I said earlier, Jimmy Haslam's the one who is kind of the wild card in this whole situation. If he wants to enact his power and hire a guy that he is obviously very fond of in Jim Schwartz, he's going to do that, and we're going to have to just live with it. But if that doesn't happen, I think more than likely we're going to have Udinski or Scheelhaase hire, and we'll discuss all of that as we get the news. I think, like I said, probably next week we'll find out for sure. I think this whole week we're going to be going through second interviews in Berea. So I'm sure we'll get leaks as the week goes on, as far as we heard the leak with Udinski this past weekend where he was in the 3-hour interview and kind of blew the Browns away. I think we'll get more leaks like that as the week goes on, either pushing a guy up in likelihood or maybe dropping a guy or two down in likelihood as the week goes on. Last thing I wanted to briefly touch on, here, is Kevin Stefanski obviously being hired in Atlanta. I think that's a good landing spot for Kevin. I actually find there to be a lot of parallels between the Falcons and the Browns whenever Kevin Stefanski arrived here in Cleveland. They have a young quarterback that they believe in, regardless of what we all think. I'm not a huge Michael Penix believer, but I think the Falcons still do think he can be a good quarterback. So they have him. They have a great young running back. They have some pretty good offensive weapons around the running back, so wide receivers, tight end. It's a very talented offense all around. Their defense has young talent. I think their defense needs a little bit more here and there. But really, I think the team is kind of budding and ready to take that next step where they're winning that division consistently. And it's an NFC South who we all know every year is up for grabs. There's no team that's really taken it by the bullhorns. I think, the Buccaneers have done that slightly, but this year, obviously, it was a down year for the Bucs. And I think if Kevin can go in there and provide a little bit of a ceiling higher than previously for the Falcons, I think they have a really good chance to win that division, be competitive. Although I don't believe the Falcons are like a real Super Bowl contender because I just don't believe in Penix enough. I think that's a team that could go to the playoffs and win their division, and of course, it's going to look really bad for the Browns next season if the Falcons win the division, which I think they'll probably be the favorites more than likely. But we're used to that as Browns fans. I think I'm not someone who's going to root for failure in regards to Kevin. I think it was just a good time to move on. Both sides, Kevin and the Browns, needed to move on. I think both sides will be better off after it. And if that takes us having to watch him in Atlanta have success, so be it. But let me know what you guys think about Kevin Stefanski in Atlanta. Let me know also how you guys view this kind of shortened list of coaches that we have narrowed it down to after just a couple weeks of doing the coaching search. With all that said, hopefully you guys all enjoyed the divisional round weekend. Have a very important week or two ahead of us in deciding the head coach. So we'll be talking about all of that very shortly. And as always, I will see you all very, very soon. Have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye.